Samma Sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everybody. Okay, today we'll be taking Sutta number 82 in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is the Ratthapala Sutta. Now, I should mention that the name of this chapter of the Majjhima Nikaya is called the Division on Kings. You might have noticed that, Rajavagga. What's rather interesting is that in at least several of these suttas, kings play a rather minor role. So it seems that the principle that the compilers of the Majjhima Nikaya went by in grouping the suttas into this chapter was that even if there is a mention of a king, whenever there's a mention of a king, even if it's in a relatively minor role, that still will explain the collection of that sutta into this chapter. So we saw last week when we took the Gatikara Sutta that really the main focus of the sutta is on the Pada Gatikara. But it's just because a king comes in a partial role later in the sutta that the sutta is classified under the heading of kings. It seems that if I were responsible for the compilation, I might have put that sutta under the chapter dealing with householders. I think that's in the 50s in the Majjhima Nikaya. And the Ratthapala Sutta I would have put under the chapter dealing with bhikkhus, since the main sort of protagonist of the sutta is a man who becomes a monk. Okay, so let us start with the sutta. Okay, the sutta begins when the Buddha has been traveling in the Kuru country together with a large number of monks, and then he eventually arrives at a Kuru town named Kotita. Now, now the Kuru country is located pretty much where Uttara Pradesh is now. It is the area where Delhi is the center of the Kuru country. So it's a bit far from where the Buddha usually would travel, which was in the eastern part of India, in the state of Kosala, which is to the northeast, and the state of Magadha, which corresponds to contemporary Bihar, which is lower down in the east. Okay, so this is a little bit distant from the Buddha's usual, the place where the Buddha usually set out on his tours. Okay, so when the Buddha arrives at this town of Kotita, then it's interesting that it refers to the Brahmin householders of Kuli Tutita herd, that this recluse Gautama, the son of the Sakyans, has arrived at our town, and then they report what they've heard, the reputation of him. And this is a standard passage which collects the 9 epithets of the Buddha, that he is an accomplished or an arahat, fully enlightened, perfect in true knowledge and conduct. Here I would translate Sugata as the fortunate one, or the one who has gone to the good, the knower of the worlds, the incomparable leader of persons to be tamed, the teacher of gods and human beings, the enlightened one, and the Bhagava, the blessed one, the exalted one. He teaches the nature of this world with all of its beings, which he has himself realized with direct knowledge, and he teaches the Dhamma, good in the beginning, good in the middle, good in the end, with the right meaning and phrasing, And he reveals the holy life or spiritual life that is utterly perfect or complete and pure. And so, after discussing the reputation of the recluse Gotama, they decide to go see him. And so they come and they pay homage to him. Some just do anjali, some just greet him in a friendly way. Others just sit down silently, waiting to hear what he has to say. And so the Buddha then gives a discourse to the people. And in this group of householders who have come to listen to the Buddha, there is one young man, who's called a clansman, by the name of Ratthapala. And he's said to be the son of the leading clan in Tulakotita. So he's not just a very ordinary person, but this is the elite, or you could say the aristocrats of that township. And as he's sitting there listening to the Buddha's discourse, then he thinks to himself that as I understand the Dharma taught by the Blessed One is not easy while living at home, while living the home life, to lead the brahmacharya, the holy life, which is utterly perfect and pure as a polished shell. Suppose I shave off my hair and beard, put on it's the kasayani vatani. It's not really yellow, but it's a kind of brownish stain color, and go forth from the home life into homelessness. So why isn't it easy to lead the spiritual life completely perfect and pure while living at home? Excuse me?
Do we have time for all the answers?
Let's get some. I mean, I've been a monk now for almost 40 years, so I've forgotten what it's like to live at home. Just having nagging parents is all I remember. Okay, wait till we get the microphone so we can get you down. down. So everybody around the world can hear what you have to say.
So for one, it sets one on a course to have a mortgage or a rent for a house to pay for and a constant source of needing to upkeep that place. So all of a sudden one has an inevitable need for income. Can't go wandering, can't go sitting today because the roof is leaking water.
Okay, anybody else have any? Don't be shy. Nobody has any ideas. We're going to stage an ordination later today. Yeah.
One of the things is when you're out there, there's a lot of cravings that bombard you, and it's hard to overcome them. They're always at you.
All these.
They're always there. They're always coming at you.
Yeah.
And so I think if you could go into a monastery and live a more reclusive life for a while, you can be trained in your concentration.
No.
Will them into wisdom. Easier to realize that there is a better life. But it's hard to let go of all those
Yeah.
snares.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, what she says is that when one is living the home life, one is constantly bombarded by, let's say, different provocations which arouse craving, and then it's hard to let go of those cravings. Okay, Richard. First, Clement.
In our daily life, we also
Mm.
our six faculties, the things that we see, a lot of those things, arouse greed, hatred, and defilement.
Yeah.
Things we hear, people's talk, music, gossip.
Yeah.
We smell,
Yeah.
taste,
Mm.
like what she mentioned, craving,
Yeah.
things. So, it's tough
Yeah.
to prevent all of this in our daily lives.
Okay, so he says that when one is living in the household life, then one is disposed to pay unwise attention to the objects of the six senses, and then these provoke greed, anger, delusion. Okay, then Richard was going to take the microphone. Depends on
Hypocrisy being standard. That is, people have relationships with people who have are supposed to have more or less esteem than they do, and more or less power,
Mm.
and so on. And so you're supposed to treat the people who are supposed to be your superiors differently from the way you're supposed to treat the people who are supposed to be your inferiors.
Mm.
So you're supposed to flatter the people above you and obey them and
Yeah.
respect them. Disrespect the people below you and
Yeah.
scorn them and
Yeah.
humiliate them.
Yeah.
This makes normal people quite hypocritical.
Mm.
They say one kind of thing in one situation
Mhm.
to one person, a totally different kind of thing to somebody else in another situation. So normal life prevents the unification of the self.
Okay. So what he says is that living in the household life, one has to behave in different ways to different people according to their, relative social position, and that leads to hypocrisy, sycophancy, having to praise and glorify others, scorning others, and so one is not able to unify oneself. Anybody else have any ideas?
In a regular household life, you look for happiness in things that you desire that you cannot provide true happiness. When you renounce those things and you live in a monastery, you try to find happiness in meditation, things that will bring you true liberation.
Yeah. Okay, so basically he says that when one is living in the household life, how did you put that again, the key point? Just the key point. Oh yeah, one looks for true happiness in things that cannot provide real happiness. Does anybody have any kids? Little ones?
I have friends who do.
Yeah.
And depending on the age of the children, it can make even meditation almost impossible.
Yeah.
You can teach little children to sit in the lap while they're sitting.
Yeah.
It can be a real meditation. And kids
Mm.
need what they need.
Yeah. Okay, so there are a whole variety of things that sort of obstructions, difficulties, impediments, temptations. But I also have to say, very frankly, that quite a few of them arise also in the monastic life. Don't form ideal images of monasteries and monastic life and monks and nuns.
I do volunteer work at the Danbury Women's Prison.
Yeah.
And I used to be accompanied by a bhikkhuni who let the women know that she actually she envied them in a way because from her point of view, they weren't as taken up by all the chores
Yeah.
of working in
Yeah.
a monastery
Yeah.
and coming and going.
Yeah.
And they were freer to have a spiritual life in prison.
Yeah. I mean, I've known quite a few monks who always sort of shake their heads and say, just too much work to meditate, not enough time. And then within the monastery also you find monks who are in high position and tend to oppress those in lower positions. And one finds monks who become hypocrites and flatterers in order to win the favor of, maybe the chief monk or the abbot. He wants to get close to the abbot, so he'll flatter the abbot to become chosen as the abbot's personal attendant, and then he could lord it over the other monks. One finds quarrels and disputes. You see, even in the Majjhima Nikaya, on a few occasions, the Sangha became so bitterly divided that they wouldn't even listen to the Buddha when the Buddha tried to reconcile the quarreling factions. Okay, so let us continue. Okay, so now, after the Buddha's while the Buddha is speaking, apparently Ratthapala is thinking in this way, and so he will wait until when the discourse is over. He waits, hanging around just maybe quietly in the back, till all of the other householders pay their homage to the Buddha and then depart. And so when they leave, when the Buddha is maybe just sitting up there alone, maybe with a monk or two attending on him, then the clansman Ratthapala comes up to the Buddha and he tells the Buddha what he's been thinking, and then he expresses the wish. He says, "Bhante, Venerable Sir, I wish to shave off my hair and beard, put on the ochre robe, and go forth from the home life into homelessness. I would receive the going forth under the Blessed One. I would receive the full admission or the full ordination." Okay, so now the Buddha asks him an important question. He says, have you gotten the permission of your parents to go forth from the home life into homelessness? And Ratthapala says, no, Venerable Sir, I haven't received my parents' permission. And then the Buddha says, Ratthapala, Tathagatas, again, to remember from last week, he's sort of generalizing this, maybe to emphasize that this is a universal, a very binding principle. Tathagatas do not give the going forth to anyone who does not have his parents' permission. Now, do you know the story about the Buddha's going forth? The Buddha's great renunciation. Did the Buddha have the permission of his parents? No. And then later, after his enlightenment, the Buddha came back to visit Kapilavatthu, and then he gave the going forth to his own son. His own son was 7 years old at the time, and so he couldn't become a fully ordained monk, but the Buddha admitted him as a novice, a samanera. So in a sense, you could say Rahula, the Buddha's son, had not only the Buddha's permission, but he was ordained on the instructions of the Buddha. But after the Buddha instructed Sariputta to ordain Rahula, then the Buddha's father, Suddhodana, came to the Buddha somewhat heart-stricken and said, Bhante, it was very difficult for me when you disappeared from the palace and became an ascetic. And now I was putting all of my hopes on your only son, Rahula, to become the leader of the Sakyans. And now Rahula has become a monk. So please, I want to make a request of you. The Buddha said, what is your request? And he said, please make a rule that nobody should be ordained without the parents' permission. But something a little bit strange has happened in the way the Vinaya has been compiled, in that the question, do you have your parents' permission, only comes up when somebody is taking the full ordination as a bhikkhu, which means that he's 20 years of age or older. And so before the ordination, they ask a series of questions, and one of the questions is, do you have your parents' permission to become a monk, or in the case of a nun, of a woman, to become a bhikkhuni, to become a fully ordained nun. But in the case of for the novice ordination, the question isn't asked. And so somebody can become a novice, even if they're 20 years old or older. They could become a novice monk without the parents' permission, as though the parents are going to be able to distinguish, if you say, oh, he's not fully ordained, he's not a bhikkhu, but there he is, the kid standing there with his head shaved, wearing the ochre robes, living in a monastery, maybe studying or meditating full time. The parents is not going to say, oh, I didn't realize there was a distinction of novices and fully ordained monks. I understand, I accept it. But the parent will say, doesn't make any difference to me. I want him at home, dressed like a normal human being, working in the office or studying to become a doctor or lawyer or engineer or scientist or teacher or whatever. And then what is done, like in a country in Sri Lanka, I remember that there was a Greek monk who had been ordained. His parents were very much against his ordination, so he didn't get the actual permission from his parents. And so he remained a novice for maybe 4 or 5 years, something like that. But he wanted to take the full ordination. And so what they do is, not legally, but they say, okay, what we're going to do is to assign you to this pious Buddhist couple who will be your Dharma parents. You go to them, maybe they bring them together and introduce. Okay, George, this is Mr. and Mrs. Wanasurya. They are your Dhamma parents. Mr. and Mrs. Wanasurya, this is George. He will be your Dhamma son. So George then asked Mr. and Mrs. Wanasurya, my Dhamma parents, may I receive ordination? And they will say, wonderful, wonderful, sadhu, sadhu. We will provide you with your robes, your alms bowl. Let us offer you your first meal after your ordination. We'll cover the expenses of the ordination. So then George will come back to his teacher. The teacher will say, do you have your parents' permission? And he'll say yes, because now he's gotten the permission from the Dharma parents. Okay, so continuing. Wrong glasses. Okay, so the Buddha says that he doesn't give the going forth, but this is what the Buddha is saying here, that he doesn't give the going forth. The going forth means the novice ordination, allowing somebody to leave the home life and take up the life of a monk, even without the full ordination. So I don't give the going forth to anyone without the parents' permission. So then Ratthapala says, I will see to it that my parents permit me to go forth into homelessness. Okay, so then Ratthapala gets up, he goes to his parents and he tells them that I've listened to the Dharma of the wandering ascetic Gautama, the Blessed One, and I want to live the spiritual life under him. So please give me permission to go forth from the home life into homelessness. And then Ratthapala's parents reply, they're not delighted at all. Probably they are followers of the Brahminic religion. They're not maybe they don't have a very friendly attitude towards the samanas, the wandering ascetics. And of course, they, like most normal parents, they deeply love Ratthapala, and especially in an Indian family, he's not just their child, but he is their only son. So in this respect, the Indians are very much like Jewish parents, like probably Chinese parents also. If you have only one son and he wants to go forth and become a monk, if the parents are devout Buddhists, then of course they'll permit it. But if they're followers, they have just the mainstream Chinese religion, mainly Confucianism with a little Taoism and Buddha ceremonies when you pass away for the funeral, then probably they'll refuse. Okay, so the parents say, "You're our only son, dear and beloved. You've been raised in comfort, brought up in comfort. You know nothing of suffering." This is quite remarkable that Ratthapala is, apparently he's 20 years or older because he becomes a bhikkhu, fully ordained immediately. And yet they say, probably in a well-placed Indian family, a quite wealthy Indian family, the child is brought up in like the lap of luxury, especially if he's the only son or the only child. They don't have to spend other things on their wealth on other children. So he takes, and the way parents dote on their only child, they give him everything that he wants. And so he's brought up with the parents doing everything to ensure that their only son is happy and content. And yet under those conditions, this young man he must have been somebody whose faculties have been matured in samsara. And so immediately that he hears the Buddha's teaching, so he realizes that life in the world is full of dukkha or suffering, and wants to go forth to put an end to suffering. But still the parents are pleading with him, and they were to say that even if you were to die, we wouldn't be willing to lose you. So how could we give you permission to go forth while you're still alive? So Ratthapala requests permission from his parents a second time, a third time. A third time the parents refuse. So when they refuse 3 times, Ratthapala is still determined. Still his mind is set on going forth. Anything within the worldly life probably seems hollow and empty and pointless to him. And so right there, right on that occasion, he just sits down or lies down on the floor and says, either you give me the going forth while I'm lying here, or I'll die. Probably, though the text doesn't say this, he might even have gone on what we call a hunger strike. He says, I won't accept any meals while I'm here. In fact, if he continues to accept the meals, it seems unlikely that he'll die, right? He'll just be sitting there. Of course, it'll get a little boring, and maybe he'll have to get up to stretch the limbs to avoid discomfort. But probably the decisive factor would be refusing food and water. Okay, so now the parents, again, they plead with him, and then they tell him, get up, dear Ratthapala, eat. Yeah, this indicates that Ratthapala must have refused to eat and drink, because they say, "Get up, dear Ratthapala, eat, drink, and amuse yourself." While eating, drinking, and amusing yourself, you can be happy, enjoying sensual pleasures, and making merit, doing meritorious deeds. So here we see a kind of split or conflict between two ways of living a good life. Okay, one way of life is the ordinary good life. You know, the parents are not enjoining him to lead a bad life, but you could lead a good life, you know, get married, have children, bring up a family, get a good job, and you'll inherit our wealth, and with the wealth you can do deeds of merit. You can observe precepts, you can perhaps sponsor rituals and ceremonies by the Brahmins to get merit, since they're probably followers of Brahmanism. You can make offerings to the wandering ascetics. You could do many good deeds which will bring merit. So that's one possibility we call the mundane path of meritorious deeds. And the other path is the path of renunciation aimed at liberation. And that will be the path of observing strict precepts, including celibacy, undertaking the life of a wandering ascetic, perhaps undertaking some of the ascetic practices, and especially devoting oneself to the practice of meditation to gain insight and to break the bonds of birth and death. And so, again, they refuse to give him permission, and this exchange goes on, 3 times. So then Ratthapala's parents are still not ready to give up, so they go to his friends, and they ask his friends to go to Ratthapala and plead with him to give up this foolish idea of starving himself to death, and try to convince him that he could enjoy himself and do meritorious deeds. So the friends go to Ratthapala, they plead with him on behalf of the parents, they try to persuade him to enjoy himself and do meritorious deeds. But again, each time, 3 times, Ratthapala just sits there, remaining silent. So finally, Ratthapala's friends come to the parents and say that, Ratthapala is very serious about this. It's impossible for us to break his will. He's determined to go forth. So really the choice, he seems set on either dying right there or receiving your permission. So it's better that you give him your permission. That way he'll continue to live, and certainly if he becomes a monk, he'll come back to visit you from time to time, and so you'll get to see him. Okay, so in this way, finally, the Ratthapala's parents relent on their refusal to give permission, and they tell the friends that we now give Ratthapala permission to go forth, but after he's become a monk, he has to return from time to visit us. So the friends go back to Ratthapala, report this, and so Ratthapala gets up, and then after he regains his strength, apparently this Ratthapala has remained sitting there, lying there, perhaps for several days, because it says he has to regain his strength, so probably has to resume taking meals in order to recover his strength. So then he goes to the Buddha and he tells the Buddha, "Now, Bhante, I've gotten my parents' permission, so please give me the going forth." And so thereupon, Ratthapala receives the going forth from the Blessed One. That is, he becomes admitted first as a novice, and then probably maybe even the same day or shortly afterwards, he receives the full ordination. He becomes a bhikkhu. Okay, and then the text tells us that not long after Venerable Ratthapala had received the full admission, a half month after he had received the full admission, the Blessed One set out to wander to Savatthi, and wandering by stages, he eventually arrived at Savatthi and stayed at the Jeta's Grove and not the Pindika's Park. And apparently Ratthapala probably went along with the Buddha. So right after his ordination, Ratthapala didn't go to visit his parents. And then the texts tell us, not before long, dwelling alone, withdrawn, diligent, ardent, and resolute, the Venerable Ratthapala, by realizing it for himself, here and now entered upon and dwelt in that supreme goal of the holy life, for the sake of which clansmen rightly go forth from the home life into homelessness. And he knew that birth is finished, the cycle of rebirths is finished, the holy life has been lived, what had to be done has been done. There is no more coming back to any state of being. And so Ratthapala had become one of the arhats. The text says here in section 14, before long dwelling alone, or not long afterwards. But the commentary says that what is meant by before long is 12 years. So Ratthapala had to stay under a teacher to learn the Dhamma, to rehearse the Dhamma that he had learned till he was able to retain it in mind. And then he had to go off into solitude and practice meditation diligently for 12 years. And then he realized the supreme goal. And even though it might seem a bit far-fetched for the commentary to be explaining before long as 12 years, we see later in the sutta that there might be some justification for that explanation. Okay, so after Ratthapala becomes an arahat, then he goes to the Buddha and he sits down and he tells the Buddha, Bhante, I now want to go to visit my parents. I had assured them when I went forth that I would come to visit them from time to time. They must be very worried about me. They haven't seen me for such a long time. And you know the way parents worry. And in those days, it seems writing was not used for personal communications. And so there couldn't have been exchanges of letters between them. So he's asking the Blessed One, please give me permission to go see my parents. And now the Buddha probably thought that if Ratthapala had not yet achieved arhatship, or at least the stage of stream enterer, he might have been subject to falling back from the monastic life. That if Ratthapala's parents tried to tempt him in various ways, he might be vulnerable. There might still be some weak spots in his heart. And so the parents might have been able to win him over and bring him back to the household life. So the Buddha then makes the determination to examine Ratthapala's mind with his own mind to see where his mind is at. And so when he does this, then the Buddha knows, directly through super knowledge, he knows that Ratthapala has eradicated all of the defilements and gained full liberation. And so therefore he's incapable of abandoning the training and returning to the household life. And so the Buddha gives permission to Ratthapala to go to visit his parents. Okay, so then Ratthapala packs his things, sets his dwelling place in order, and then he gradually wanders from Savatthi to his hometown of Tulakotita. Then when he arrives in Tulakotita, he sets up his dwelling place, or he comes to dwell in this Megachira garden. It's the game garden, the garden where the deer and other animals are dwelling. And so then one morning, perhaps it was the morning after he arrives there, he dresses and he takes his alms bowl and his outer robe and goes into the town on alms round. And he's wandering for alms from house to house. And obviously he was intending to go to his parents' house. So then he's coming to his parents' house. And on that occasion, his father was sitting in a hall that would be probably like the porch in a modern house. He's having his hair combed. Of course, in those days, the people would have long hair. And so he probably has like a servant brushing his hair, putting oil on it. Okay, so then the father sees Ratthapala, or he sees this monk coming in the distance, and then he thinks to himself, or maybe he speaks to the servant, and he says, "My own son, my own dear and beloved only son, was made to become a monk by those bald-pated recluses, those baldy-headed recluses." Remember, we came across the statement, when was it? Was it last week or a couple of weeks ago? It was last week. It was Sutta 81. Now, this was the way the Brahmins would speak about the Buddhists, or about any of the samanas, the ascetics, in a rather scornful way. So apparently his father didn't recognize Ratthapala. He just saw this figure coming towards him, with a shaved head, with an ochre-colored robe. And he couldn't identify Ratthapala, but all he thought was that this must be one of the members of that, one of the henchmen of that ascetic Gautama who was here many years ago. And those guys, they don't have any concern for our children. They just draft them as though they're like a king drafting a young man into the army. And so when this wandering ascetic came to the house of this eminent family of Tulakotita, the father didn't give alms, but just abused them and said, "Get away from here, you rascal, you good-for-nothing beggar, you wandering ascetic. Get away, we don't want you here." Okay, so Ratthapala is trained. It's a bit strange that, he's come back to visit his parents. And so one would think, if it were a normal child, if I were in that situation, I would look up and say, "Father, Dad, don't you recognize me?" Then father would have said, "Oh, Ratthapala, I'm sorry, I didn't recognize you. Come in, come in." But for some reason, Ratthapala doesn't say that. He just, maybe he's training to bear the situation patiently. Any other ideas? Why doesn't he address his father? Any ideas?